Napoleon Bonaparte's fall was ultimately caused by the catastrophic overextension of French resources, culminating in the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. That failure shattered the perception of his invincibility. By 1813, a coalition of European allied powers, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, had united against him, delivering a crushing defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. As Allied armies marched into Paris in early 1814, Napoleon's marshals refused to fight on, forcing his abdication. The European powers, seeking stability over vengeance, looked back to the past to secure the future, paving the way for the return of the exiled Bourbon dynasty. Louis Stanislas Xavier, now Louis XVIII, returned to Paris in 1814 after 23 years of exile. The atmosphere was a bizarre mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. Louis XVIII was the brother of the famed Louis XVI, who was guillotined by the revolutionaries in 1793. The new king was not a fool. He understood that he could not simply rewind the clock to 1789, the year the French Revolution erupted. The revolution had fundamentally changed the social fabric of France. Peasants owned land, the church had lost its property, and the concept of equality before the law was deeply ingrained. To bridge this gap, Louis XVIII issued the Charter of 1814. This is the most essential document of the era. It was a constitutional compromise. On one hand, it asserted the king's authority, declaring that this charter was a gift from the monarch to his people, not a right demanded by them. On the other hand, it preserved the key gains of the revolution: civil liberties, religious freedom, and the Napoleonic Code. It established a bicameral parliament, mimicking the British system, with an appointed chamber of peers and an elected chamber of deputies. However, this first restoration was shaky. The returning nobles, who had spent decades in exile, treated the French citizenry with contempt, and the army felt disrespected. This friction created the opening for the 100 Days, where Napoleon escaped from Elba and briefly reclaimed the throne. It was a romantic doomed endeavor that ended in the mud of Waterloo in June 1815. When Louis XVIII returned for the second time in July 1815, the mood had shifted from conciliation to vengeance. The European coalition armies were no longer polite guests. They were occupiers who demanded heavy reparations and stripped France of its borders. Domestically, the royalists were furious. They felt betrayed by the people who had welcomed Napoleon back. This unleashed the White Terror, a violent purge across the south of France where royalist mobs attacked Bonapartists, Protestants, and Jacobins. Politically, this anger manifested in the election of 1815. The result was the formation of the Chambre, introuvable, the unobtainable chamber. This parliament was dominated by ultra-royalists who were famously more royalist than the king. They wanted to execute traitors, return land to the church, and dismantle the centralized state. They were so radical that Louis XVIII, a moderate who just wanted peace, found them impossible to govern. In a supreme irony, the king had to dissolve a parliament that was too loyal to him in order to save his own monarchy. Following the dissolution of the erratic Chambre introuvable, France entered a period of surprising stability and liberal progress. Louis XVIII relied on moderate ministers, most notably the Duke of Richelieu and Élie Decazes, to steer the ship of state down the center. During these 4 years, the Restoration government passed its most forward-thinking legislation. The Gouvion-Saint-Cyr Law of 1818 was a masterstroke of military reform. It ended the monopoly of the nobility over officer commissions, establishing that promotion should be based on merit and seniority. It professionalized the army and integrated Napoleonic veterans with royalist officers. Shortly after, the Serre Laws of 1819 revolutionized the press. Censorship was relaxed, and crucially, press crimes were to be tried by juries rather than government judges. This allowed a vibrant intellectual political culture to blossom in Paris. For a brief moment, it seemed that the constitutional monarchy might actually work. The moderate experiment came to a screeching halt on the night of February 13, 1820. Charles Ferdinand, the Duc de Berry, the king's nephew and the only young male capable of continuing the Bourbon bloodline, was stabbed to death outside the Paris Opera by a Bonapartist saddler named Louis-Pierre Louvel. The political impact was immediate and catastrophic. The ultras seized upon the tragedy, claiming that liberalism has hands of blood. The moderate Prime Minister Decazes was forced out, and the pendulum swung violently to the right. To ensure the liberals never held power again, the government passed the law of the double vote. This was a blatant piece of electoral rigging. It took roughly the wealthiest quarter of the voters, mostly conservative landowners, and allowed them to vote twice, once in their local district and again at the departmental level. This effectively locked the middle class out of power and handed the parliament back to the aristocracy. Censorship returned and the church was invited back to take control of the education system. The era of compromise was over. In 1824, the pragmatic Louis XVIII died. He was succeeded by his brother, the Comte d'Artois, who became Charles X. If Louis was a man of the 19th century, Charles was a man of the 18th. He despised the charter and believed in the divine right of kings. Charles X's reign was a series of provocations against the French people. He organized a medieval-style coronation at Reims. He pushed through the Sacrilege Act of 1825, a law that was rarely enforced but terrifying in its symbolism. It suggested that there was no separation between Catholic dogma and French law. He further alienated the nation with the indemnity of the émigrés. To compensate nobles who had lost land during the revolution, the state paid out a massive sum of money. To finance this, Charles slashed the interest rates on government bonds. This directly took money from the pockets of the Parisian bourgeoisie who held the bonds and gave it to the idle aristocracy. By 1830, the government was in a deadlock. The voters, despite the rigged system, kept electing liberals who opposed the king. Charles X decided to break the stalemate with a coup. On July 25, 1830, he issued the July Ordinances. These decrees dissolved the newly elected chamber before it even met, imposed strict censorship, and stripped the vote from the commercial middle class, leaving only the landed aristocracy with a voice. It was the final straw. On July 27th, Paris erupted in what became known as the Three Glorious Days. Shopkeepers, workers, and students built barricades and fought the royal troops. The army, demoralized and reluctant to shoot their own people, began to defect. Realizing he had lost the capital, Charles X abdicated and fled to England. Though Charles abdicated in favor of his grandson to save the dynasty, the revolutionaries ignored the Bourbon heir. The crown was instead offered to his cousin Louis Philippe of the House of Orléans. If you liked this episode, hit like and subscribe and hop onto our next episode in this list of France's 100-year history between 1814 and 1914,